to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. So this week I'm covering a case that I discussed on my friend's podcast, British Murders, back in May. I had a story in mind, which I will get to next week, but I just did not have the time or energy to research or write. I came down with something awful last Wednesday, and I literally didn't leave my bed for 2 days. Once my fever broke and I was finally feeling better, I could tell that I just needed to rest my body and mind. But that doesn't mean I need to skip an episode. I figured I would revisit the story of Donald Henry Gaskins, also known as Peewee Gaskins. Some of you may have heard it in my collaboration with Stuart Blues, but I doubt all of you did, and it's definitely one you'll want to hear. So, here we go. Donald Gaskins was given the nickname Peewee at birth. Even as a full-grown man, he was only 5'4", so I would tower this guy. I'm just going to call him Peewee because that's more fun than Donald. Plus, he literally thought his name was Peewee until his late teens. He got into some trouble with the law and had to give his legal name in court, only then realizing his actual name was Donald. Can you imagine being in school and writing Peewee at the top of your paper, literally thinking your parents named you that? Peewee was born March 13th, 1933 in South Carolina. He was the youngest of 5 children, all born out of wedlock, all with different fathers. Peewee's mom, Eula Parrott, was a prostitute and, to be honest, quite a shitty mother. She didn't pay attention to any of her children. They pretty much were left to fend for themselves. When Peewee was just 1 year old, while unsupervised, of course, he drank from a bottle of kerosene. After this, he experienced random convulsions until the age of 3. As he got older, and this is so completely horrible, Eula would physically and sexually abuse Peewee. She pimped him out for others to essentially rape her young child. Honestly, no wonder he's so messed up. Most serial killers grow up with a poor home life, and I would say your mother making a profit off allowing her pedophile clients to rape you is the poorest of home lives. I cannot imagine how anyone could do this to a child, let alone your own flesh and blood. Peewee quit school when he was 11 years old. He started working on a farm and then a car repair shop. At the car shop, he made a couple of friends, Marsh and Danny. Apparently, it was common to drop out of school that young. Anyways, Peewee, Danny, and Marsh formed their own little gang when they were 13 years old. They called themselves the Trouble Trio. They weren't your average 13-year-olds. They acted like legit gang members. They robbed businesses, stole cars, and then used those cars to go pick up prostitutes. I don't know what prostitute is getting in a car with 3 pubescent boys. A desperate one, I guess. The 3 of them preyed on younger boys. They would rape and then threaten to kill them if they told anyone. At one point, they gang raped Marsh's younger sister. She told her parents about what happened. They tied up all 3 boys and beat the crap out of them. That was the end of the Trouble Trio gang activity. But that didn't stop Peewee. He continued his crime spree solo. One day, Peewee was in the middle of a home robbery when he realized the house wasn't empty. A woman walks into the living area to see a strange man, or child really, standing there. As he runs out, he swings an axe at her head. He assumes he killed her because, well, an axe to the head sounds pretty damaging. But she survived, and she was able to help police identify her attacker as Donald Peewee Gaskins. He was sent to reform school. You know what happens to rapists in prison? What goes around comes around. Karma's a bitch, Peewee. One of the older and obviously bigger boys, because, well, to Peewee, I think everyone was bigger, this boy made Peewee his quote-unquote sweetheart. He used him like a slave, forcing him to do everything for him. Also, as a sex slave, he would rape Peewee whenever he felt like it, and then he traded Peewee to other boys for things like cigarettes. I'm sure it felt like his mother pimping him out all over again. Peewee claimed that he was once raped consecutively by 20 different inmates. On multiple occasions, he attempted to escape the reform school, each time earning a beatdown from the guards. But finally, one escape plan worked, and he was free. While he was out, he joined the traveling circus. I know, you can't make this shit up. While working in the circus, he fell in love and got married to a 13-year-old. That seems pretty young for marriage, even in the 1940s. Maybe his new wife convinced him, or maybe he felt guilty for escaping, but he willingly returned to the reform school to finish his sentencing. He was let out when he was 18, fresh out of reform school, and guess what job he gets? Burning down farms for insurance scammers. How do you even find a job like that? It's not like when you walk into a store and ask if they're hiring. The scammer that he worked for had a daughter, and she witnessed Peewee burning a field and threatened to turn him in. But threatening him was not a good idea. Peewee beat her with a hammer. He goes to prison for attempted murder and serves 6 years. He's lucky she survived, or he would have been in there much longer. And it didn't take long for Peewee to become the prison sweetheart. He was so much smaller than the other men, he knew he needed to do something to prove to others that he was someone to be feared. He made friends with the biggest, baddest dude in prison, Hazel Brazel. Then, one day, while Hazel was sitting on the toilet, Peewee came up behind him and slit his throat. He claimed self-defense to the guards, and they knew Hazel's reputation and didn't question him. He had to go to solitary confinement for 6 months and added 3 years to his sentencing. I guess this was a good plan, right? Taking out the most feared man in prison. He quickly went from the bottom of the food chain to the top. Peewee's wife filed for divorce in 1955. He had a breakdown in prison and escaped. I hear prison escape and picture each day chiseling away at the wall behind a poster in the gym until you've tunneled your way out. Something elaborate like that. Well, Peewee crawled into a trash bin that was rolled out and dumped into a garbage truck. I guess that's a perk to being tiny. He stole a car and drove to Florida, where he found work at another carnival. And just like before, he quickly falls in love and gets married. You know when marriages are doomed and people say, I'll give it a year. Well, this marriage lasted 2 weeks. So, after that, he finds himself a carny girl. Her name was Betty Gates. Betty convinced Peewee to drive to Tennessee with her so she could bail her brother out of jail. Once they got to Tennessee, Peewee and Betty got a hotel. Peewee went into the jail, handed over the bail money, and then walked back to the hotel room. To his surprise, the room was empty. Betty was gone, and so was his car. He didn't bail out her brother. It was actually Betty's husband. He'd been played. And things just kept getting worse for Peewee. The police show up. He doesn't even try to run. He just puts his hands up and surrenders. He was taken back to prison and served the remainder of his sentence, adding on 9 months for his escape. He was released in 1961. Peewee went right back to home robberies. I feel like this type of behavior is an addiction, getting out of prison and immediately going back to the same old shit. It's one thing if you're struggling to survive and need the money, but I think he just loves the life of crime. He actually describes it as, quote, them aggravated and bothersome feelings that drove him to commit these crimes. About a year later, he married his third wife. While married to her, he's arrested for raping a 12-year-old girl. As you can imagine, that was the end of that marriage. While waiting for his court date for the rape, he fled town. He stole another car and drove to North Carolina this time. Peewee must have been a charmer because he married again to a 17-year-old. But she turned on him and called the police, informing them of the rape. He served 6 years at the Columbia Penitentiary, being released on parole in 1968. He stayed out of trouble for a whole year, but those bothersome feelings came back strong. Peewee picked up a hitchhiker in September of 1969. He wanted to have sex with her, and she basically laughed at him. I'm not sure letting him down gently would have had a different outcome, but he beat her until she passed out. Then he proceeded to rape and torture her. She was still alive when he tied weights to her body and threw her in a swamp. This was the beginning of Peewee's murder spree. Supposedly, between 1969 and 1975, he killed over 80 hitchhikers. He didn't discriminate, killing both men and women. He found pleasure in torturing his victims. He had cannibalistic tendencies, cutting off their body parts and eating them. Sometimes even forced the victims to eat their own body parts. Peewee spent his weekends picking up hitchhikers, something he did for fun between his serious murders. That is what he called it when he killed people he actually knew, like his 15-year-old niece, Janice Kirby. In November of 1970, Janice and her friend Patricia were walking home from the bar. Must have been pretty lenient with the underage drinking at that bar. Even in 1970, I think the legal drinking age was 18. Peewee offered the girls a ride home, but instead he took them somewhere secluded where he raped and drowned them both. Another serious murder was 20-year-old Martha Dix. She had a crush on Peewee and tended to hang around the car repair shop where he sometimes worked. He poisoned her, which doesn't fall into his normal rape and torture theme, but the next set of murders sure does. And honestly, while researching, I read this part and closed my laptop. I had to take a break and come back to it the next day because it's bad. Really, really bad. Peewee was friendly with a woman named Doreen Dempsey. She was a 23-year-old single mother, and he found out that she was pregnant again. Both her 2-year-old daughter and her unborn baby were to a black man. Well, Peewee was super duper racist. A white woman having babies with a black man was reason enough for him to want to kill her. June of 1973, Peewee saw Doreen and her daughter, Robin, waiting at the bus station. He pulled over to offer them a ride. Doreen accepted. I mean, it's not like he was a stranger. She knew Peewee. Instead of taking them where they wanted to go, he drove to the woods where he raped and killed Doreen in front of her 2-year-old. Then he raped and killed the toddler as well. He buried them together in a shallow grave. He later stated that raping the 2-year-old was the best sex of his life. Seriously, it makes me physically ill to say those words out loud. In 1975, Peewee killed a family of 3 whose van broke down on the side of the road. Up until this point, he had committed his crimes solo, but this time he needed help. He had a friend, Walter Neely, come fix up the van so he could drive it back to his home. He painted it and sold it for a profit. And Walter wasn't a stranger to crime either. He was recently released from prison. The perfect partner. Peewee owned a hearse. He openly shared with his buddies at the bar that he used it to transport his victims to a, quote, private cemetery. I think it's pretty strange if you drive a hearse and you're not a funeral director, right? Then a woman named Suzanne Kipper propositioned Peewee with a hit job. She was willing to pay him $1,500 to kill her ex-boyfriend, Silas Yates. She assigned 2 men to witness the murder and helped him bury the body after. So now he has his just-for-fun murders, his serious murders, and his money-making murders. A woman named Diane Neely and her new boyfriend attempted to blackmail Peewee. I'm not sure if there's a relation to his friend Walter Neely, perhaps an ex-wife, or just coincidence that they have the same last name, but they wanted $5,000 or they were going to turn him in for murder. Want to guess what happened? Peewee's like, yeah, sure, meet me in the woods and I'll give you the $5,000. Then he murdered them both. He continued to rape, torture, and kill random people along the highway and occasionally people he knew. A 13-year-old local girl named Kim Gilkins turned him down for sex, and it resulted in her death. Keep in mind, he's probably in his 40s at this point. One evening, Peewee caught 2 boys robbing the car repair shop where he worked. I'm sure you can guess their fate. My sources don't go into detail on how he murdered them, but he brought his buddy, Walter Neely, to help take the bodies to his private cemetery, where he buried his serious murder victims. I can't believe he's gotten away with so much, especially with the locals getting picked off. But it wasn't going unnoticed. The missing 13-year-old raised a lot of eyebrows. Rumors were swirling about Peewee. Well, not rumors, it's all true. Police came to his home with a search warrant and found clothing that belonged to Kim Gaskins. His friends and family were questioned, and Walter Neely broke down. He led the police straight to Peewee's private cemetery. Police found 8 bodies buried there. Both Peewee and Walter Neely were charged with 8 counts of murder. Even though Walter didn't kill any of them, he helped conceal their deaths and transport their bodies. May 24th, 1976, Donald Peewee Gaskins was found guilty and received a death sentence. Capital punishment varies from state to state, and the laws have changed over the years. In November of 1976, the death penalty in South Carolina was determined unconstitutional, and his sentencing was changed to life in prison. 2 years later, South Carolina changed the law again. His sentencing would stay as life in prison, but he couldn't resist an inside hit job. He killed a fellow inmate for money, landing him back on death row. Realizing his fate, he spent his remaining time on Earth working with author Wilton Earl on a book. It was called Final Truth, the autobiography of a serial killer. The morning of his scheduled execution, September 6, 1991, he attempted to take his own life by cutting his wrists. But he wasn't taking the easy way out. Doctors stitched him up and turned around and strapped him to the electric chair. The autobiography, Final Truth, was released in 1993. The thing with this case is only 8 bodies were ever found. He confessed to nearly 100 murders, but was not able to lead police to any other bodies. The dude is definitely a murderer. He killed 2 prisoners and at least 8 people. Who's to say he wasn't capable? I think it's possible he embellished his story because he wanted to go down as the biggest, baddest serial killer of all time. What are your thoughts? I'll be honest, I haven't read Final Truth. I wish I had the spare time, but I literally have none. If any of you have read it and have any insight on this case, I would love to hear about it. And just a little pop culture fact. In my research, I discovered a pop punk band from Indonesia named Peewee Gaskins. I'm not sure why you would want to associate yourself with a child rapist serial killer, but they must be big fans. It's one thing to discuss these cases, but to idolize these people, there's something wrong with you. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to leave me a review. It helps so much with the visibility of the show. You can also leave a review on my Facebook page. I am Killer Stories Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, and on Twitter, I am Killer Stories PC. Email me story suggestions or sponsorship inquiries to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories to make a one-time donation. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a killer story.